So, how do you actually find the words for chaos?
Oh, that's a tough question.
Right, because when a city is, burning, or when the social fabric is just tearing apart, standard vocabulary kind of fails us.
Yeah, you can't just say things are bad. It doesn't carry any weight.
Exactly. You need language that paints a real picture of intensity. So welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're doing something a little bit different for you all. We aren't just synthesizing a topic. We're decoding the language of crisis.
Yeah, it's a bit of a meta deep dive today. We're looking at a specific piece of broadcast journalism. It's a report from the BBC's Quentin Somerville, and we're using it as a case study.
For those of you listening to sharpen your English, this is huge. We're putting on our language detective hats.
Yeah.
We want to see how a high-level reporter uses English to describe a really complex, violent situation.
We're taking the engine of a news report apart to see how the pieces fit together, but we should set the expectation right up front. The source material is heavy.
It's very heavy. It's a report from Culiacan, Mexico, covering the eruption of violence following the death of a major figure in the drug world, Namio Ruben Uguera-Cavantes.
Better known as El Menio. And this report, it deals with drug cartels, armed conflict, loss of life. It is graphic.
But if you're listening to this deep dive to build your English fluency, processing this kind of high-stakes vocabulary is absolutely essential. I mean, you can't really claim fluency if you only know how to talk about the weather or, the stock market.
Right. You need the words for conflict, too. Real life happens, and you need to be able to read the news and actually understand the nuance of what's going on.
So here's the mission for today. We're breaking this down into 3 layers for you. First, the gist. What is actually happening on the ground? Listening comprehension.
Then the toolkit. That's where we pull out the specific military and descriptive vocabulary the reporter uses. Vocabulary building.
And finally, the analysis. How the reporter structures the story and how the people involved use language to justify their actions. Media literally.
It's a full linguistic breakdown. Let's start with the gist, though, because if you don't understand the context, the vocabulary just won't stick.
Okay, so if I'm an English learner and I just missed the headlines and drop right into this BBC report, what is the core situation? Give us the clear, standard English summary.
The headline summary is basically this. A power vacuum has triggered a civil war. El Menio, who was one of Mexico's most wanted drug lords, was killed during an arrest operation on a Sunday.
Wait, let me stop you right there. Because usually when a high-value target is taken out, the logic is that things should get safer, right? Like the head of the snake is gone.
You would think so, but the report suggests the exact opposite happened here. It's the Hydra problem. You cut off one head, 2 more appear.
Wow.
His death didn't stop the violence. The report says it sparked a massive wave of instability across the land. Now, instead of one strong leader controlling the territory, you have these different factions fighting for the throne.
So it's power struggle. And it seems like a 3-way standoff, right? You have the government and the army who are, trying to control the situation.
And they're under immense pressure to do so. The report specifically mentions pressure from Donald Trump to show results.
Right. There's that international pressure. Then you have the cartels. But it's not just cartel versus army.
No, it's cartel versus cartel. The reporter explicitly describes it as a civil war within the gang itself.
Which brings us to the third group in this standoff.
The civilians.
The people of Culiacan. They're just trying to live their lives, and they're caught right in the middle of this.
So that is your core context. A dead kingpin, a fractured criminal empire, and a city caught in the crossfire.
Got it. Okay, let's move to the toolkit. I really want to look at the specific words the reporter chose to build this picture for the listener.
Economy of language is so crucial in broadcast news. You only have maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Every single word has to do heavy lifting.
You can't waste a breath. So the first phrase that really landed for me was right at the top of the report. It said, his death sparked a wave of violence.
Yes.
If we're looking at this from a vocabulary perspective, why sparked? Why not just say it started a wave of violence or caused it?
That's a great question. Sparked is a very deliberate metaphor. Think about physics. A spark is just a tiny, hot piece of material. It only creates a massive fire if there's already fuel on the ground. Gasoline, dry wood, whatever.
Ah, okay.
By saying the death sparked the violence, the reporter implies the tension was already there. The fuel was ready to burn. The death was just the trigger.
That implies so much volatility. Like if I say I started a fire, it sounds like I carefully built it.
Right.
But if I say a spark set it off, It suggests an explosion, something sudden and out of control.
Exactly. It frames the city as a powder keg waiting to blow. It is much more dynamic than just saying caused.
Okay, let's look at the description of the location itself. The report calls Culiacan a city under siege.
Under siege is a fascinating choice here. Historically, a siege is a medieval military tactic. You surround a castle, cut off the food and the water, and you just wait for them to surrender.
It implies being completely trapped.
Yes.
But Culiacan isn't a medieval castle. It's a modern city. There are highways, internet, infrastructure.
And that is exactly why the phrase is so effective. It tells you that the citizens feel totally trapped despite all that. They can't move freely, the enemy is at the gates, or, on the street corners in this case.
And the report backs up that feeling of being under siege with a really jarring detail about the paramedics.
Julio and Hector.
Right. The reporter notes that even the paramedics wear bulletproof vests.
In almost any part of the world, a paramedic is neutral. They are generally safe. If the people whose literal job is to save lives have to dress like soldiers just to go to work, you are definitely under siege.
It blurs the line between a civic emergency and an actual war zone. And speaking of that war zone imagery, let's talk about the action verbs used for the destruction. The reporter didn't say businesses were burned. He said they were torched.
There is a massive nuance of aggression there. If you're building your vocabulary, take note of this. Burned can be passive or completely accidental, like, my toast burned, or the house burned down because of faulty wiring.
Torched means something else entirely.
Torched is active. It's violent. Someone came with gasoline and a match. It implies malicious arson. You torch something to send a message. It's a word that contains the criminal's intent.
That makes perfect sense. Similarly, the roads weren't just closed, they were blockaded.
Again, we see military vocabulary applied to civilian infrastructure. A blockade is a forcible closing of a supply route. We're not talking about a traffic cone and a detour sign. We're talking about burning trucks parked horizontally across a highway to stop the army from moving.
That military terminology really sets the scene. Let's pivot slightly to the medical and emergency vocabulary because I think it anchors the reality of the violence. We hear the term bystander regarding a man who was shot in the chest.
Bystander is a vital word for news comprehension. If you break it down, it means standing by. It refers to someone who is present at an event but is absolutely not participating in it.
So in a crime report, it emphasizes their innocence.
Exactly. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a cartel member. He was just a bystander. He just happened to be standing there when the bullets started flying.
And when the victims finally get to the hospital, the scene isn't even safe there. The military had to set up cordons.
Right. C-O-R-D-O-N. A cordon. It's a barrier, usually made of people like police or soldiers or sometimes just tape to prevent access to an area.
You usually hear about police cordons at a regular crime scene to protect evidence, right?
You do. But here, the cordon is purely protective. It's a military line set up to stop gunmen from following the ambulances right into the hospital to finish the job.
Which is just a terrifying thought. The hospital is supposed to be the ultimate sanctuary. Setting up a cordon implies the threat has breached the perimeter of safety entirely.
And notice how the reporter refers to the paramedics as first responders. That's become a very standard term in the US and the UK, grouping police, fire, and medical personnel together. But in this specific context, they are responders to a war, not just car accidents.
Yeah. Okay, let's shift into segment 3 of our deep dive. I want to look at the idioms and descriptive language. There was one phrase I hear constantly in geopolitical news, and it showed up here. Tit for tat.
Ah.
The quote is, "No amount of government firepower can stop the tit for tat killings."
It's a deceptively simple phrase for something so incredibly deadly. Tit for tat means retaliation. Equivalent retaliation. I hit you, so you hit me.
It sounds almost childish, like a game kids play on a playground.
That is actually the origin of the phrase. But in modern journalism, it describes a cycle of revenge that has absolutely no strategic end. If I bomb your base, you bomb my base. Then I have to bomb you back to save face. It implies a perpetual motion machine of violence. Using it tells the listener, this isn't going to end soon.
And describing the people who are driving this endless cycle, the reporter uses another great phrase, men who lurk in the shadows.
Lurk! That is a fantastic verb for setting an atmosphere. You don't just stand in the shadows, you lurk.
It implies hiding, but with bad intent.
A predator lurks. A monster lurks. By using that word, the reporter dehumanizes the cartel members slightly. He turns them into these hidden menacing threats rather than just calling them soldiers or fighters.
And because these predators are everywhere, the report says everyone is fair game.
Now that is a hunting term. If an animal is fair game, it means it's open season. You are legally allowed to shoot it.
But applying that to people.
Right. When you apply fair game to people, to women, children, to bystanders, it means the rules of engagement are completely gone. There is no moral code protecting anyone anymore. Everyone is a target.
The reporter also used a very sharp contrast that really stuck with me. He described the horror of the situation by saying, "We are seeing medieval killings in modern Mexico."
That is a classic juxtaposition, placing two highly contrasting things side by side to highlight the extreme difference between them.
Because modern Mexico brings to mind, skyscrapers in Mexico City, a booming economy, internet, rich culture.
Exactly. And medieval brings to mind the Dark Ages, dungeons, brutal torture.
He was referring to the specific condition of the bodies they were finding, wasn't he?
Yes, it is deeply graphic, but the report explicitly mentions bodies being flayed. That means having the skin removed or being dismembered.
Which means cut into pieces.
Right. These are ancient, primitive forms of brutality. By calling them medieval, the reporter is saying that despite all of our modern technology and society, human behavior in this conflict has regressed back to something barbaric.
But dismembered is one of those words that sounds very clinical, but it describes an absolute nightmare.
It is a forensic term. Reporters use it because it is precise. It avoids being overly emotional or sensational, but the mere fact of it is so horrific that the word itself carries a massive impact.
Let's pivot to the interview in the report. We actually hear directly from a cartel member. He's a fentanyl producer. This was fascinating to me because of how he spoke. He didn't sound like a thug or a monster. He sounded like a CEO defending a controversial product.
This is where we look at rhetoric and argument, the art of persuasion. Because the reporter does challenge him. He asks him about the guilt. He essentially says, "Your product kills people. Doesn't that weigh on you?"
And the producer deflects immediately. He uses the basic supply and demand argument.
Yes. He says, as long as there are consumers, we're going to keep doing this. He frames the international drug trade not as a violent crime, but just as a market response.
We're simply fulfilling an order.
In his view, he isn't forcing anyone to take the drug.
It's a classic way to diffuse responsibility. Hey, I'm just the service provider. But look, obviously the original source has politically charged elements, and we're definitely not endorsing anyone's viewpoints here. We're just analyzing the language they use to construct their defense.
Exactly. We're looking at the mechanics of the language. And he uses a very specific grammatical structure to distance himself. Did you catch the conditionals he used?
The if-then statement.
Precisely. If we connect this, or if they want it, we provide it. No one forced them. By using conditional grammar, he places the agency, the power to choose, entirely on the addict.
He completely strips himself of the role of the aggressor.
He does. He effectively says, I am a neutral party in this transaction.
He also specifically rejected a label during the interview. Donald Trump had called the cartels terrorists.
And he hated that label. To him, a terrorist is someone political. A terrorist kills for a specific ideology. He sees himself as a businessman. He even calls the different variations of fentanyl tropicals. Like, we have different flavors, like tropical.
That was genuinely chilling. Comparing fentanyl, which is an incredibly lethal synthetic opioid, to fruit candy.
It's a euphemism, using a soft, pleasant word to describe something harsh or deadly. It shows a complete disconnect between his so-called business and the reality of the bodies piling up outside. It totally sanitizes what he's actually doing.
Okay, let's move to the final layer of our deep dive, narrative structure. We've looked at the vocabulary and the rhetoric, but how does the reporter string this all together to make you care? Because news isn't just a list of facts, it's a story.
Good journalism always has a narrative arc. One technique Somerville uses here is something we can call the contrast technique, or the zoom.
The zoom, like zooming in with a camera.
Exactly. He starts wide. A city under siege, the army, the cartels, big faceless groups and big statistics. He tells us the government claims they are beating the cartels.
But then he contrasts that official statement with reality on the ground.
Right. News reports often use that structure. Here's what the officials say, but here's the reality. But if you just stay on the macro level, the listener gets numb. It becomes noise. So halfway through the report, he zooms in.
Ronaldo.
The mother. This brings in the human element. Suddenly, the story isn't about geopolitics or trade. It's about one specific woman in a field with a shovel looking for her son.
And the reporter uses a very specific noun phrase for who she is looking for. The disappeared.
Los desaparecidos. This is a crucial cultural term in Latin American context. In standard English, if someone is missing, well, they might have run away. They might have gotten lost in the woods.
Right, missing is vague.
But the disappeared is a passive verb construction used as a noun. It implies something was intentionally done to them. They were taken. Their bodies were hidden. It's almost a political status. They weren't confirmed dead. They aren't alive. They're disappeared.
It completely captures that terrible limbo the families are trapped in. There's no body to bury. It's a permanent state of waiting.
And when describing Ronaldo's search, the reporter uses a really powerful idiom. He says, "A mother will always look for her child to the ends of the earth."
We hear that phrase in movies a lot.
We do. It signifies limitless effort. It means distance and difficulty are completely irrelevant. By using that idiom here, the reporter honors her struggle. He's saying her love is stronger than her fear of the cartel. It gives dignity to her pain.
But despite that powerful human element, he doesn't give us a happy ending. His sign-off is really bleak. He says, there is no victory in sight.
In sight. That creates a visual metaphor for the future. If land is in sight, you can see the shore, you know you're almost safe. If victory is not in sight, it means we're lost at sea. It's a dark prediction that this situation is going to continue indefinitely.
And then he creates a visual loop at the very end. He says, the drugs flow and bodies pile up.
It's rhythmic, flowing, piling, flowing, piling. It reinforces that tit-for-tat concept we talked about earlier. The report ends exactly where it began, in chaos. It leaves the listener feeling the heavy weight of that cycle.
It's highly effective structuring. You don't walk away feeling resolved. You walk away feeling the gravity of the situation.
Which is the ultimate goal of serious journalism. It shouldn't necessarily make you feel good. It should make you understand.
All right. We have covered a lot of ground today. For everyone listening who is actively building their English vocabulary, let's try to package this into a mental word bank for you to take away.
Let's do a quick recap of the key toolkit. We had siege, which is the concept of a city being surrounded and pressured. We had sparked, used as a metaphor for the trigger event of a conflict.
We had tit for tat, describing that endless cycle of retaliation. Cordon, the protective police or military line. And bystander, meaning an innocent party caught in the middle.
And don't forget the important distinction between burned and torched. Torched implies violent, malicious intent, which is crucial for understanding crime reporting.
So why does all this matter? I mean, why should someone learning English care about words like cordons and factions?
Because the news is the primary way we engage with the global world. If you open CNN or Al Jazeera or the BBC tomorrow, you aren't going to read simple sentences like, the bad men fought.
Right.
You are going to read, factions engaged in tit-for-tat attacks, leaving the city under siege. If you know these code words, you stop translating word for word in your head. You start visualizing the actual scene. You essentially upgrade your language operating system from a student to a global citizen.
I love that. It's all about gaining access to the real global conversation. Well, before we wrap up today, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over. We touched on it briefly, but I really want to dig just a little deeper into it.
What's on your mind?
The use of the phrase civil war. The report explicitly calls the cartel infighting a civil war.
It is a very heavy label for a journalist to apply.
Usually a civil war is, the North versus the South, or the royalists versus the parliamentarians. It implies two potential governments fighting for the actual soul of a nation.
Correct. It validates both sides as legitimate political entities.
So when a major news outlet like the BBC applies that specific term to criminal gangs fighting each other, what are they actually saying about the country?
That is the provocative question, isn't it? By calling it a civil war, they're implying that the cartel has become a de facto state. They have their own territory, they have an army, they have an economy, and now they have a civil war. It suggests the actual official government has completely lost its monopoly on power. It elevates these criminals from just robbers to rulers.
That is a terrifying shift in language, because it reflects a terrifying shift in reality.
It does. Language shapes exactly how we perceive power.
Well, on that intense note, here's my challenge to you, the listener. Find a news article today in English. It doesn't have to be about Mexico. It could be about politics in your own country, or even a trade dispute in the business section. Look for the standoff. Look for the spark. Look for the tit-for-tat scenario. Once you know how to spot these linguistic patterns, you realize they are everywhere.
Happy reading and stay curious.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
喜欢这种学习方式，欢迎订阅我的频道，让我们一起用下一个10分钟，把商业英文变简单。